Good evening, everyone. I'm Crystal Cruz.
I'm Susie So. We begin tonight with breaking news. Former U.S. President George H.W. Bush has died. He was 94 years old.
Pat Harvey has a look back at his long life and the president's career.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
When George Herbert Walker Bush took the oath of office in 1989, he already had an impressive legacy. World War II hero, Texas oil man, director of the CIA, and vice president. Politics would dominate his life. Bush was born in 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. On his 18th birthday, he enlisted in the Navy, becoming the youngest fighter pilot in World War II. During an air raid in the Pacific, he was shot down, a rescue famously captured on film.
I knew that if something didn't pick me up, I would be captured.
Shortly after returning from the war, he married Barbara Pierce. They would have 6 children and 17 grandchildren.
Wisest, smartest, most decent, caring person I know.
Bush studied at Yale University. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa in just 2.5 years, but he left New England to make it on his own. He carved out his fortune in the wildcat oil fields of Texas.
What a day!
In the 60s, Bush turned to politics. He was elected to Congress in 1966 and became a power player in the Republican Party.
Leaving the door open.
In 1980, he ran unsuccessfully against Ronald Reagan for the GOP nomination, then agreed to be Reagan's running mate. He was Reagan's vice president for 8 years before becoming the 41st president of the United States.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
During his one term in the White House, Bush signed the treaty that ended the Cold War. He played a key role in the reunification of Germany. The following year, he took on Saddam Hussein for invading Kuwait, launching Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War.
A new world order can emerge, a new era.
Bush formed a coalition of 30 nations to liberate Kuwait in just 6 weeks, but he was criticized for not removing Iraq's defiant leader. After the war, the economy slowed down.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Bush was forced to break that campaign promise and raised taxes. As the economy continued to sink, so did his approval ratings. And in 1992, he lost the election to Bill Clinton. In later years, the former rivals raised millions for victims of the tsunami in Southeast Asia and Hurricane Katrina. Bush remained active during retirement. He saw his oldest son become president, and another son, Jeb, serve 2 years as Florida's governor. He even went skydiving to celebrate his 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays.
Can't play golf anymore, but I still can jump out of a plane.
But in his final years, Bush's health deteriorated and he developed a form of Parkinson's that made it difficult to walk. He used a wheelchair during a 2011 visit to the White House when President Obama awarded him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Bush was at his wife's side holding her hand when she passed at their Houston home. He called her the most beloved woman in the world. His devotion to her, to the end, never failing.
And that was Pat Harvey reporting. Now there is a statement on your screen by the president's son. Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, and I are saddened to announce that after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. The entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41st life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolence of our friends and fellow citizens.
Yeah, and we know that George H.W. Bush was in and out of the hospital for the past few years or so. And we also know that foreign policy was kind of what drove his presidency. Here to talk about that more now is KCAL 9 political reporter Dave Bryan. Dave?
Yeah, foreign policy was definitely President Bush's strong suit. And what happened here was that during his 4 years in office, office. There were military operations in Panama and in the Persian Gulf. Also, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved itself. So he had a great deal of success with foreign affair issues, and that was really his strong suit. Domestically, he was not as strong, and of course, that tax increase just really is what killed him when he ran for re-election.
What do you think made him really stick out as a president, Dave?
He was a calm and moderate Republican president, way out of line with the kind of Republican presidents that we're seeing right now. But he was someone who sort of had a long record in the party, and he was very, very popular,
Sure.
very down-to-earth guy. And as I say, his foreign policy expertise really is what carried him. And this was a time, as we just talked about some of these issues, the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union dissolving, these were important issues at the time. These were the foreign issues that really made headlines during that era.
Had he recently been outspoken on Trump? Anything like that you can remember or recall recently?
I don't think so. He was very, I think, limited, in the amount of, I think, analysis and evaluation that he spoke of recently. As you indicated, he was ill for quite a while recently. And had some episodes where he had to be hospitalized. So I think at that point in his life and in his career, he pretty much stayed on the sidelines.
All right, Dave, we'll check back in with you in just a few minutes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for